15 Things You Never Knew About Ingrid Bergman. From her secret nickname on Swedish film sets to the elevator operator who accidentally launched her Hollywood career, Ingrid Bergman's life was filled with surprises that would shock even her biggest fans. Behind the saintly screen image was a rebellious actress who defied death threats, sparked Senate condemnation, and inspired one of Hitchcock's greatest films through a scandalous love affair. Here are 15 things you never knew about Ingrid Bergman. Fact 1. Her career started with an elevator operator. Ingrid Bergman's entire Hollywood career hinged on one of the most unlikely coincidences in movie history, involving a young elevator operator who had no idea he was about to change cinema forever. In 1939, a Swedish couple living in New York City had just seen a beautiful romantic film called Intermezzo, starring a relatively unknown Swedish actress named Ingrid Bergman, and they couldn't stop talking about how wonderful she was in the movie. These enthusiastic parents decided to share their excitement with their son, who worked as an elevator operator in a fancy Park Avenue apartment building in Manhattan. The young man listened politely as his parents raved about this talented Swedish actress and her performance, though he probably didn't think much of it at the time. What he didn't know was that one of the residents in his building was Kay Brown, who worked as the head of the New York office for legendary Hollywood producer David O. Selznick. Brown had been specifically sent to Europe by Selznick to scout for foreign films that would be perfect for Hollywood remakes, and she was always on the lookout for new talent and stories. When the elevator operator mentioned his parents' glowing review of Intermezzo and this Swedish actress, Brown became curious enough to seek out the film and watch it for herself. After seeing Bergman's luminous performance, Brown immediately contacted Selznick in Hollywood, recommending both the story and the actress for an American remake. Selznick was intrigued enough to pursue the project, and within 6 months of that casual elevator conversation, Ingrid Bergman found herself on a ship to America with a Hollywood contract in hand. She would later laugh about this incredible stroke of luck, saying, "I owe my whole career to that elevator boy." Without that random conversation between a son and his movie-loving parents, one of cinema's greatest stars might never have made it to Hollywood at all. Fact 2. She had a prophetic childhood diary entry. Long before Ingrid Bergman became one of Hollywood's most celebrated actresses, she was already dreaming of stardom and writing about it in her personal diary with the kind of passionate determination that would define her entire career. At just 15 years old, living in Stockholm, Sweden, Bergman had formed a small theater group with 6 of her girlfriends, and they were preparing to put on a play they had chosen called The Green Elevator. The young girls took their amateur production very seriously, setting up a proper stage in someone's home complete with benches for the audience, stage lights, and all the theatrical equipment they could gather together. When Bergman saw their makeshift theater space fully assembled for the first time, she was completely overwhelmed by the sight of it all, and felt something she had never experienced before in her young life. That night, she sat down with her diary and wrote in Swedish about the incredible rush of excitement she had felt standing on that little homemade stage. She described how she had run up to the stage area and couldn't help herself from stepping onto it, writing that she had never felt as happy as she did in that moment when she stood there looking out at the empty benches. The entry continued with her confessing that the experience had filled her with such joy and certainty about her future that she felt compelled to make a direct appeal to God. "Please God, make me a great actress," she wrote in her diary that night, capturing in those 6 simple words the burning ambition that would drive her from a lonely childhood in Sweden to international stardom. The diary entry, written around 1930 to 1931, shows that even as a teenager, Bergman had an absolute certainty about her destiny and the courage to ask for exactly what she wanted from life, no matter how impossible it might have seemed at the time. Fact 3. Her Swedish nickname was Better Later. Before Ingrid Bergman became the polished Hollywood star we remember today, she was a young perfectionist on Swedish film sets who had developed such a distinctive habit that the entire crew gave her a nickname that stuck throughout her early career. During her time making films in Sweden in the 1930s, Bergman would finish a scene and then immediately turn to the director with the same phrase every single time, saying, "I'll be better later," in her quest to improve her performance. This wasn't just an occasional comment or something she said when a take went particularly badly, but rather a constant refrain that happened after nearly every single take, regardless of how well the scene had actually gone. The Swedish film crews found this habit so endearing and so uniquely characteristic of the young actress that they started calling her Better Later as a friendly nickname, combining her most frequently spoken English words into one memorable term. What made this nickname particularly charming was that it perfectly captured Bergman's relentless drive for perfection and her genuine belief that she could always do better, even when directors and fellow actors thought her performances were already excellent. The crew members weren't making fun of her ambition, but rather celebrating the work ethic and dedication that set her apart from other young actresses of her generation. This early perfectionism would become one of Bergman's defining characteristics throughout her entire career, driving her to constantly push herself to new heights and never settle for what she considered to be good enough. The nickname Better Later became a fond reminder of those formative years in Swedish cinema when Bergman was still learning her craft, but already showing the determination and self-criticism that would eventually make her one of the greatest actresses in film history. Even decades later, when Swedish film industry veterans would reminisce about working with the young Ingrid Bergman, they would smile and remember her as Better Later, the actress who was never quite satisfied with her own performance. Fact 4. She was too tall for leading men. At 5 feet 9 inches tall, Ingrid Bergman towered over many of Hollywood's biggest male stars during an era when leading men were expected to appear physically dominant next to their female co-stars, creating ongoing challenges that required creative solutions from directors and cinematographers throughout her career. Her height became such a well-known issue in Hollywood that studios had to keep special equipment on hand whenever Bergman was cast opposite shorter actors, which happened more often than audiences might imagine. During the filming of Casablanca in 1942, Humphrey Bogart was a full 2 inches shorter than Bergman, which created obvious problems for romantic scenes where the leading man traditionally needed to appear taller and more imposing. The solution involved Bogart wearing specially made platform shoes throughout the production and standing on wooden boxes during many of their scenes together, while Bergman would often remove her shoes or sit on lower surfaces to help minimize the height difference. Alfred Hitchcock faced an even greater challenge when he cast Bergman opposite Claude Rains in Notorious, since Rains was only 5 feet 7 inches tall, making him 2 full inches shorter than his leading lady. Hitchcock's solution was far more elaborate and involved building an intricate system of hidden ramps that would gradually raise Rains to Bergman's eye level as they walked together, all carefully positioned below the camera's view so audiences would never notice the artificial boost. The director also had Rains wear elevator shoes in many scenes, and when they needed to walk hand in hand, Hitchcock would position the ramps to give Rains the extra height he needed to appear as tall as Bergman on screen. Bergman herself was reportedly very understanding about these arrangements and would often joke about the situation, once saying that she always had to take her shoes off for her male co-stars, but they still needed to stand on boxes even then. Years later, when she met Yul Brynner during the filming of Anastasia and suggested putting a small block under him to help with their height difference, he famously replied that he would show the world what a big horse she was, rather than stand on a box. Fact 5. A senator called her a powerful influence for evil. In one of the most extraordinary political attacks ever launched against a Hollywood actress, Colorado Senator Edwin C. Johnson took to the floor of the United States Senate on March 14, 1950, to deliver a scathing denunciation of Ingrid Bergman that would go down in history as one of the most dramatic examples of moral grandstanding by an elected official. Senator Johnson, who was known by the nickname Big Ed, was absolutely furious about Bergman's affair with Italian film director Roberto Rossellini, which had resulted in her pregnancy while she was still married to her first husband. Standing before his fellow senators, Johnson declared that Bergman had perpetrated an assault upon the institution of marriage and called her one of the most powerful women on earth, and I regret to say, a powerful influence for evil. The senator didn't stop there, going on to describe both Bergman and actress Rita Hayworth, who was also involved in a public extramarital affair at the time, as apostles of degradation who were corrupting American values through their personal behavior. Johnson was so outraged by what he saw as Hollywood's moral decay that he actually proposed new federal legislation that would have allowed the government to license performers and filmmakers, giving officials the power to revoke those licenses if actors engaged in what the government considered to be scandalous personal behavior. His proposed bill would have banned movies based not just on their content, but on the moral standing of the people who made them, effectively giving politicians the authority to end careers based on personal conduct. The senator's inflammatory speech made headlines across the country and contributed to the massive public backlash that forced Bergman into exile from Hollywood for several years. Fortunately for both Bergman and the film industry, Johnson's proposed licensing legislation never passed, but the damage to her reputation was already done. 22 years later, in 1972, Senator Charles Percy of Illinois entered an official apology into the congressional record, calling Bergman one of the world's loveliest, most gracious, and most talented women, and acknowledging that she had been the victim of bitter attack in this chamber. Fact 6. Her love affair inspired Hitchcock's Rear Window. One of Alfred Hitchcock's most beloved films, Rear Window, was directly inspired by Ingrid Bergman's passionate and secret love affair with Robert Capa, the legendary war photographer who had become famous for his incredible courage in documenting some of the most dangerous moments of World War II. Capa was the only civilian photographer who landed with Allied forces on Omaha Beach during D-Day in 1944, and his dramatic photographs from the Normandy invasion later inspired the opening sequence of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. Bergman and Capa first met in Paris in June of 1945, when she was traveling through the city on her way to entertain American soldiers in Berlin, and according to her daughter Isabella Rossellini, Bergman found the photographer tremendously charming and amusing, quickly falling in love with him. Their affair lasted for 2 years and was kept completely secret from the public, since Bergman was still married to her first husband, Swedish neurosurgeon Petter Lindström, at the time. During their relationship, Capa followed Bergman to Hollywood, where he briefly tried his hand at acting, appearing in a B-movie called Temptation in 1946, but he quickly decided that the movie world was not for him and returned to his photography career. The romance eventually ended when Bergman was ready to ask for a divorce and marry Capa, but he told her that he couldn't tie himself down, explaining that he wasn't the marrying kind and needed to remain free to travel the world covering wars and dangerous assignments. According to Isabella Rossellini, Alfred Hitchcock was apparently fascinated by this love story between the glamorous Hollywood actress and the fearless war photographer, and he used their relationship as the inspiration for creating the photographer character played by James Stewart in Rear Window. The film's central character, who is confined to a wheelchair and spends his time observing his neighbors through his camera lens, was Hitchcock's way of exploring the voyeuristic nature of photography and the complex relationship between those who document life and those who live it. Fact 7. She received thousands of death threats. The public backlash against Ingrid Bergman during her affair with Roberto Rossellini was so intense and vicious that she received an overwhelming flood of hate mail that shocked even seasoned Hollywood observers who were used to celebrity scandals. During the early months of 1950, Bergman was bombarded with 47 telegrams that have been preserved to this day, along with 10 to 14 huge mailbags filled with threatening letters that arrived at her door every single day for months. The content of these messages was so disturbing that columnist Art Buchwald, who was given permission to read through her mail during the height of the scandal, later described the experience in an interview, saying the letters were filled with words like dirty whore, bitch, and son of a bitch, and noting ironically that they were all written by people who signed their names as Christians. The telegrams were particularly cruel, with one reading, "You gave Rossellini the cue to wrong you," and another stating, "You played a bitter part, Ingrid, when you actually lived the Stromboli role and bore a bambino." Many of the letter writers made it clear that they felt personally betrayed by Bergman's actions, with some saying they would never let their children watch movies starring an actress who had done the things you did. Another telegram read, "I would not give up my Swedish ancestry or American citizenship for any old Italian," showing how the scandal had taken on nationalist and xenophobic overtones that went far beyond simple moral outrage. The sheer volume and intensity of the hate mail forced Bergman to remain hidden in her apartment for months, and with the New York Times reporting in February of 1950 that she remained almost constantly in her apartment for the last 2 months to avoid publicity ahead of her baby's birth. The threatening nature of many of these messages created genuine safety concerns for Bergman and her family, contributing to her decision to remain in Europe for several years, rather than return to face the continued hostility in America, where her former fans had turned into an angry mob demanding her exile from Hollywood. Fact 8. She died on her 67th birthday. In one of the most poignant coincidences in Hollywood history, Ingrid Bergman passed away at the exact moment when her 67th birthday turned into the day after, dying at midnight on August 29, 1982, which was precisely 67 years to the day after she had been born in Stockholm, Sweden. This remarkable timing meant that Bergman lived for exactly 67 years, not a day more or less. creating a perfect bookend to a life that had always seemed to unfold with a sense of dramatic timing. Bergman spent her final hours in her apartment in Chain Gardens, London, surrounded by just a few close people, including her ex-husband Lars Schmidt and 3 others who had gathered to be with her during her last days battling breast cancer. Earlier that evening, they had shared what would be their final toast together, drinking to her life and career before she quietly slipped away as the clock struck midnight and her birthday officially ended. The scene in her bedroom captured something deeply meaningful about who Bergman was as a person, because there on her bedside table sat a copy of The Little Prince, the beloved book by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and it was open to a page near the very end of the story. This detail suggests that even in her final days, when the cancer had spread throughout her body and she knew the end was near, Bergman was still reading and finding comfort in literature, staying true to the curious and thoughtful nature that had made her such a compelling actress. The timing of her death created an almost mystical quality to her passing, as if she had somehow chosen to complete her life's journey on the anniversary of its beginning. Her memorial service was held later that year at St. Martin-in-the-Fields Church in London, where 1,200 mourners gathered to honor her memory, including fellow actors like Liv Ullmann, Sir John Gielgud, and many others who had worked with her throughout her remarkable career spanning 5 decades in film, theater, and television. Fact 9. She was an orphan by age 14. Ingrid Bergman's childhood was marked by a devastating series of losses that would have broken many young people, but instead seemed to fuel her determination to create imaginary worlds and characters that would eventually make her one of cinema's greatest actresses. When she was just 2.5 years old, her mother Friedel died, leaving young Ingrid to be raised by her father Justus, who was a talented painter and photographer with dreams of his daughter becoming an opera star. The loss of her mother at such a tender age created what Bergman later described as living with an ache that she wasn't even aware of at the time, but which shaped her entire emotional landscape and may have contributed to her ability to tap into deep feelings of longing and sadness in her performances. Her father became the center of her world, doting on his only daughter and encouraging her love of performance by photographing her constantly and having her pose in elaborate costumes and scenes. When Bergman was 14 years old, tragedy struck again when her beloved father died of stomach cancer in 1929, leaving her completely devastated and without her primary source of love and support. She was sent to live with her paternal aunt Ellen, who had a heart condition but welcomed the orphan teenager into her home and provided what seemed like a stable new beginning for the grieving girl. However, fate had one more cruel blow in store. Because just 6 months after taking Bergman in, Aunt Ellen died of heart disease, leaving the 15-year-old girl to face yet another devastating loss and another complete upheaval of her living situation. With nowhere else to go, Bergman was then sent to live with her paternal uncle Otto and his wife Hulda, who already had 5 children of their own, and were suddenly responsible for raising a 6th child, who had experienced more trauma and loss than most adults. This series of losses forced Bergman to become remarkably self-reliant from a very young age and taught her to create emotional refuges in her imagination, skills that would serve her well when she began acting professionally and needed to access complex emotions for her roles. Fact 10. She worked while hiding advanced cancer. Ingrid Bergman's final acting performance in the television movie A Woman Called Golda in 1982 stands as one of the most remarkable examples of professional dedication in entertainment history because she completed the entire production while secretly battling such advanced breast cancer that insurance companies flatly refused to provide coverage for the project. The cancer had spread throughout her body to such an extent that by the time filming began, it had reached her spine and caused her 12th vertebra to collapse, while only a small portion of her left lung was still functioning, and her right lung had completely stopped working. According to Charlotte Chandler, who wrote about the production, Bergman's rapidly deteriorating health was considered such a serious problem that if anyone involved in the project had known the true extent of her condition, no one would have agreed to move forward with filming. The insurance situation became so dire that the producers had to find alternative ways to protect their investment because no company was willing to take on the enormous financial risk of insuring an actress whose cancer was so advanced and spreading so rapidly. Despite being in constant pain and barely able to breathe properly, Bergman managed to hide her suffering from the cast and crew throughout the entire production, delivering what many consider to be one of her finest performances as the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. Her daughter Isabella later commented that watching her mother's performance in the finished film was like seeing a completely different person, saying that Bergman never showed that kind of strength and determination in her personal life, where she had always been more vulnerable and gentle. The producer had specifically chosen Bergman for the role because, as he explained, "People believe you and trust you, and this is what I want," because Golda Meir had the trust of the people. Bergman's arm was terribly swollen from her cancer surgery during filming, but she managed to portray the strength and authority of one of history's most powerful political leaders, while her own body was failing her, creating a performance that would earn her a posthumous Emmy Award. Fact 11. She refused Hollywood's makeover demands. When Ingrid Bergman first arrived in Hollywood in 1939 to work with legendary producer David O. Selznick, she immediately faced the same pressure that virtually every foreign actress encountered from the studio system, which believed that European stars needed complete physical transformations to appeal to American audiences. Selznick had very specific ideas about what changes needed to be made to turn this 24-year-old Swedish actress into a proper Hollywood star, and his demands were both extensive and deeply personal. The producer wanted to completely change Bergman's name because he felt that Americans would never learn to pronounce Ingrid correctly, considering it too Germanic-sounding for wartime audiences who were already suspicious of anything that seemed foreign or European. Beyond the name change, Selznick also insisted that Bergman needed significant dental work to cap her teeth, which he considered imperfect by Hollywood standards, and he wanted her eyebrows completely reshaped through aggressive plucking to give her a more conventional movie star appearance. Bergman later remembered the meeting where these demands were presented to her, saying, "Immediately, I was considered too tall, and they were going to do something with my face and change my name." However, instead of meekly accepting these conditions like many other actresses might have done when facing the power of a major Hollywood studio, Bergman delivered an ultimatum that shocked Selznick and his staff by threatening to return to Sweden immediately if they insisted on changing her appearance or identity. Her refusal was based partly on practical considerations, since she felt she had worked too hard to establish herself as an actress in Europe under her real name and didn't want to throw away that recognition, but it was also a matter of personal pride and authenticity that would define her entire career. Fortunately for both Bergman and cinema history, Selznick eventually recognized the wisdom of her position and changed his mind, even going so far as to ward off makeup artists who approached her with powder puffs, insisting that she be filmed as naturally as possible with minimal cosmetic enhancement. Fact 12. Ernest Hemingway called her daughter. Ingrid Bergman developed one of the most touching and unexpected friendships in Hollywood history with the legendary writer Ernest Hemingway, who became a father figure to her during a time when she desperately needed emotional support and guidance from someone who understood the pressures of fame and artistic integrity. Their relationship was so close and familial that they created their own special nicknames for each other that perfectly captured the paternal bond they had formed, with Hemingway affectionately calling Bergman daughter, while she always referred to him as Papa. This friendship began during the 1940s when both were at the height of their careers and dealing with the complex challenges that came with international fame and public scrutiny of their personal lives. Hemingway, who was already established as one of America's greatest writers and had won the Nobel Prize for Literature, saw something in Bergman that reminded him of his own struggles to maintain authenticity in a world that constantly tried to shape and control artistic expression. The relationship was particularly meaningful for Bergman because she had lost her own father when she was just 14 years old, and Hemingway's paternal affection helped fill a void that had existed in her life for many years. Their correspondence and personal interactions were marked by the kind of warmth and protective care that typically exists between a loving father and his daughter, with Hemingway offering advice and emotional support during some of the most difficult periods of her career. What made their friendship even more remarkable was that it transcended the usual superficial relationships that were common in Hollywood social circles, instead developing into a genuine emotional connection based on mutual respect for each other's work and shared understanding of the sacrifices required to create meaningful art. Hemingway admired Bergman's dedication to her craft and her willingness to take risks in both her professional and personal life, while she valued his wisdom and experience in navigating the treacherous waters of public fame, while trying to remain true to one's artistic vision and personal values. Fact 13. Her final words to Hitchcock were about death. In one of the most profound and moving conversations in Hollywood history, Ingrid Bergman's final meeting with Alfred Hitchcock became a moment of unexpected wisdom and comfort that perfectly captured both her strength of character and the deep friendship they had developed over 3 decades of working together. This last encounter took place when both legendary figures were facing their own mortality, with Hitchcock terrified of his approaching death and Bergman already battling the advanced breast cancer that would claim her life just 2 years later. During this emotional meeting, Hitchcock broke down in tears as he expressed his overwhelming fear of dying, revealing a vulnerability that few people had ever seen from the master of suspense who had spent his career exploring themes of death and danger on screen, but was now confronting the reality of his own finite existence. Rather than offering empty reassurances or trying to change the subject, Bergman responded with the kind of direct honesty that had characterized her entire approach to life and relationships. Looking at her old friend and collaborator, the woman who had starred in 3 of his greatest films including Notorious and Spellbound, Bergman said simply, "But of course you are going to die sometime, Hitch. We are all going to die." Her words were delivered not with cruelty or dismissiveness, but with the gentle acceptance of someone who had already come to terms with her own mortality and understood that facing death was simply part of the human experience that everyone must eventually confront. According to Bergman's own recollection of this conversation, her straightforward acknowledgement of mortality seemed to bring Hitchcock a sense of peace that all the comfort and denial from other friends had failed to provide. By speaking honestly about death rather than avoiding the topic, she helped him realize that his fear was natural and shared by everyone, making it less isolating and terrifying. Hitchcock died in 1980, followed by Bergman just 2 years later in 1982, making their final conversation a bittersweet goodbye between 2 artists who had created some of cinema's most enduring masterpieces together. Fact 14. She was fluent in 5 languages. Ingrid Bergman possessed one of the most remarkable linguistic abilities in entertainment history, speaking and acting professionally in 5 different languages throughout her career, which allowed her to work seamlessly across international film industries in an era when most actors were limited to their native tongues. Her multilingual skills weren't just conversational but reached the level of complete fluency needed for complex dramatic performances, making her one of the most versatile actresses who ever lived in terms of crossing cultural and linguistic boundaries. Bergman's language abilities developed naturally from her unique childhood and international upbringing, starting with Swedish as her native language since she was born and raised in Stockholm, while also learning German fluently because her mother was German and the family spent summers in Germany visiting relatives. When she arrived in Hollywood in 1939, she spoke virtually no English but worked intensively with language coaches to master not just basic conversation, but the subtle nuances needed for sophisticated dramatic dialogue. Her dedication to learning English perfectly paid off when she became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, but she didn't stop there. Later acquiring Italian during her years living in Italy with director Roberto Rossellini, where she made several films entirely in Italian, and became completely comfortable performing in that language. She also learned French well enough to act professionally in French productions, demonstrating an extraordinary ear for languages and the intellectual discipline required to master multiple linguistic systems. What made Bergman's multilingual abilities even more impressive was that she didn't just learn these languages for basic communication, but developed the sophisticated vocabulary and emotional range needed to deliver powerful, dramatic performances in each one. She could convey subtle emotions, deliver complex philosophical dialogue, and handle everything from romantic scenes to intense dramatic confrontations in Swedish, English, German, Italian, and French, making her truly unique among international stars. This linguistic versatility allowed Bergman to work with directors and actors from around the world throughout her 5-decade career, from her early Swedish films to her Hollywood classics to her later European art films, creating a body of work that spans multiple cultures and film traditions in ways that few other actors have ever achieved. Fact 15. Howard Hughes bought every airline seat to impress her. In one of the most extravagant and bizarre romantic gestures in Hollywood history, billionaire industrialist and aviation pioneer Howard Hughes demonstrated his obsession with Ingrid Bergman by purchasing every single available seat on all commercial flights traveling from New York to Los Angeles, effectively monopolizing air travel between the two cities just to force her to accept a ride on his private airplane instead. This incredible display of wealth and determination shows just how far Hughes was willing to go to spend time with the Swedish actress who had captured his attention. Hughes, who was known for his eccentric behavior and unlimited financial resources, had developed a fascination with Bergman that went far beyond normal admiration for a movie star, and he was determined to find ways to insert himself into her life, regardless of the cost or effort required. By buying up every seat on the commercial airlines that Bergman might use to travel between the two most important cities in the entertainment industry, Hughes created a situation where she would have no choice but to accept his offer of private transportation if she needed to make the cross-country journey. The sheer scale of this gesture was mind-boggling, even by the standards of Hollywood excess, because it meant that Hughes had to coordinate with multiple airlines and purchase hundreds of seats across numerous flights, spending what would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money just to eliminate Bergman's transportation options. This wasn't just about impressing her with his wealth, but about creating a scenario where he could have her undivided attention during the long flight across the country in the luxury and privacy of his own aircraft. Hughes was famous for his pursuit of Hollywood actresses and his willingness to spend enormous amounts of money to win their attention, but even by his own standards, this airline seat scheme represented an unprecedented level of planning and financial commitment. The fact that he was willing to disrupt commercial air travel and inconvenience countless other passengers just to engineer a private moment with Bergman reveals the lengths to which one of America's richest men would go when he became fixated on a particular woman.